Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening.
Officer, on what grounds? The detector didn't alert. Explain the cause.
It's a random check. Cooperate.
Then state the policy you're following. On camera.
The alarm at the security checkpoint was still blaring when Judge Marcus Williams knew his life was about to change. He stood there, immaculate in a pressed navy blue suit, briefcase in hand, and watched as 3 TSA officers walked toward him. The looks on their faces sent a chill down his spine. What they didn't realize was that they had just made the most catastrophic mistake of their careers, a mistake that would unravel a web of corruption, racial bias, and abuse of power far more extensive than anyone could have imagined. Judge Marcus Williams was 52 years old and had spent the last 15 of them on the bench. He was known throughout the legal community for his meticulous preparation and an iron grip on his courtroom. Defense attorneys respected him, prosecutors feared him, and criminals knew that an appearance before Judge Williams meant they were in for the fight of their lives. He had built his reputation on being stern but fair, never showing favor based on race, class, or connections. On that Tuesday morning in November, Judge Williams was traveling to a judicial conference in another state. His flight was early, which meant he had to be at the airport before 6:30 a.m. The terminal was relatively quiet, populated by a handful of business travelers and early morning commuters making their way through security. Judge Williams had walked this path dozens of times over the years. He knew the drill. He placed his briefcase and shoes in a plastic bin, walked through the metal detector, and waited for his belongings on the other side. That's when Officer Danny Rodriguez saw something that caught his eye, not because of anything suspicious about Judge Williams or his belongings, but because of something that triggered an entirely different kind of reaction. Officer Rodriguez had been a TSA agent for 8 years. He considered himself an experienced, thorough professional. What he did not consider himself was particularly sharp or perceptive. If he had been, he might have noticed the quiet confidence in Judge Williams's posture. He might have seen the expensive watch, the cut of the suit, or the leather briefcase that was worth more than Rodriguez's monthly salary. Instead, all Rodriguez saw was a well-dressed black man traveling alone through his checkpoint. He called over his supervisor, a woman named Janet Pierce, who had been overseeing security operations at this particular checkpoint for over a decade. Pierce glanced at Judge Williams, then nodded at Rodriguez without a single word exchanged. Both officers knew exactly what was about to happen. This was a routine they had performed countless times before. As Judge Williams collected his briefcase and began putting on his shoes, Officer Rodriguez approached him. The officer asked him to step aside for additional screening. Judge Williams looked up, slightly puzzled but not yet alarmed. He asked if there was a problem with his bag or if he had forgotten to remove something from his pockets. Rodriguez didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he simply repeated that additional screening was necessary. And here is where the story took its first dramatic turn. Because Judge Williams, unlike so many others who had been singled out by these officers, did not simply comply in silence. He wasn't intimidated or flustered. Instead, he did something Rodriguez and Pierce had never encountered in all their years of conducting these questionable stops. He began asking pointed questions. Williams asked Rodriguez to specify what, exactly, had triggered the secondary screening. He asked if his bags had tested positive for any prohibited substances. He asked if the metal detector had indicated a problem. Rodriguez stammered, clearly unprepared to deal with someone who actually understood how security protocols were supposed to work. Judge Williams then asked to speak to his supervisor. Rodriguez pointed to Pierce, who was standing just a few feet away, having clearly listened to every word of the conversation. Williams approached Pierce and introduced himself, politely but firmly. He explained that he was a frequent traveler, that nothing unusual had occurred during his screening, and that he wanted to understand why he had been singled out for extra attention. Pierce's response would become the centerpiece of the entire controversy. She told Judge Williams that he had been selected for additional screening on a completely random basis. When he pointed out that he could see at least 6 other passengers who had passed through the same metal detector without any extra screening, Pierce grew defensive. Questioning security procedures, she said, was in itself suspicious behavior. Judge Williams remained calm, but anyone who knew him would have recognized the slight twitch of a muscle at the corner of his eye. It was the same look he got in his courtroom when a lawyer tried to introduce illegally obtained evidence or a witness tried to lie under oath. It was the look of a man who had spent a lifetime identifying falsehoods and was now witnessing one being used against him. He asked Pierce for her name and badge number. She provided both reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the request. Williams then asked if their conversation was being recorded by surveillance cameras. Pierce confirmed that it was, though she seemed to regret the admission as soon as the words left her mouth. At that moment, Officer Rodriguez returned with a handheld metal detecting wand. He instructed Judge Williams to spread his arms and legs for a pat-down. Williams complied, but he did something else as well. He took out his cell phone and began recording the interaction. The moment that camera appeared, the entire dynamic shifted. Pierce immediately told Williams to put the phone away, claiming it was prohibited to record the screening process. Williams calmly explained that he was in a public area of the airport and was well within his rights to record his own interaction with public officials. He also mentioned that if the TSA was concerned about transparency, perhaps they should reconsider their procedures. Rodriguez completed the pat-down and found nothing. He then announced that Judge Williams's briefcase would need to be searched by hand. Williams watched as Rodriguez opened his briefcase and began removing items one by one. Legal documents, a laptop, pens, business cards, and a small leather wallet containing his judicial credentials. Rodriguez picked up the wallet and began flipping through it. When he saw Judge Williams's Judicial ID, his expression transformed. The color drained from his face as he realized who, exactly, he had been treating like a potential criminal for the past 10 minutes. He quickly showed the wallet to Pierce, whose own expression shifted from annoyance to something approaching panic. But this is where the story gets even more interesting. Instead of immediately apologizing and ending the search, Pierce doubled down. She claimed that judicial credentials did not exempt anyone from security screening and that they would proceed with their protocol regardless of Williams's position. She said it loudly enough for other passengers to hear, as if to make sure everyone knew she wouldn't be intimidated by his title. Judge Williams closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of pulling rank, demanding special treatment, or using his position to end the harassment, he decided to let it play out. He wanted to see just how far these officers would go. He wanted to document every detail of their conduct, because he suspected that what was happening to him had happened to countless other travelers who lacked his knowledge, his resources, or his platform to fight back. What Judge Williams didn't know was that his instincts were dead on. What he was experiencing was not an isolated incident or a case of overzealous screening. It was part of a systemic pattern of racial profiling that had been going on for years, specifically targeting successful black travelers who dared to look prosperous while flying. Pierce instructed Rodriguez to conduct an even more thorough search of Williams's belongings. She wanted every document examined, every pocket of the briefcase searched, every electronic device swapped. Williams stood there patiently, his phone still recording, and watched as the two officers systematically violated every principle of reasonable security screening. Rodriguez took out Williams's laptop and announced that it would need to be powered on for inspection. Williams complied, entered his password, and allowed the officer to look at his desktop. Rodriguez clicked on several files, opening confidential court documents and case notes containing sensitive information about ongoing legal proceedings. This was a line that even Pierce seemed to recognize had been crossed. She whispered for Rodriguez to close the laptop, but the damage was done. Judge Williams had just witnessed officers, with no legal authority, accessing privileged attorney-client communications and confidential judicial materials. The search continued for another 15 minutes. Other passengers began to gather, some recording on their own phones, others simply staring at the spectacle unfolding before them. A well-dressed black man being subjected to treatment that no other traveler in sight was experiencing. It was an ugly scene, and Pierce knew it, but she couldn't seem to find a way out of the hole she had dug for herself. Officer Rodriguez found nothing suspicious, because there was nothing suspicious to find. Judge Williams was exactly who he appeared to be, a respected federal judge traveling to a professional conference with nothing more dangerous than legal documents and a laptop. When the search was finally over, Pierce handed Williams's belongings back to him with what could charitably be described as a non-apology. She said the screening was complete and he was free to proceed to his gate. There was no explanation for why he had been selected, no acknowledgement that the search had been unusually invasive, and no recognition that they had just spent 20 minutes harassing an innocent traveler. Judge Williams methodically packed his briefcase, taking his time to ensure everything was in order. He was in no hurry now. His flight was boarding, but he had more important things to do than catch a plane. He approached Pierce one last time and asked for her supervisor's contact information. She reluctantly provided the name and phone number of the airport's head of security. Williams also requested an incident report form and asked how he could obtain a copy of the surveillance footage of their interaction. Pierce's demeanor shifted again. She became defensive, asking why he needed all this information. For the first time since the encounter began, Williams smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just identified a vulnerable target. He told Pierce that he intended to file a formal complaint about their conduct. He mentioned that he found their screening procedures questionable and their explanations inadequate. He planned to review the incident thoroughly to determine if any policies or laws had been violated. What he didn't tell Pierce was that he had already identified at least a half-dozen potential federal violations in their conduct: illegal search and seizure, violation of attorney-client privilege, discrimination on the basis of race, and abuse of authority. And that was just in the first 10 minutes of their interaction. Williams missed his flight, of course, but he didn't seem particularly concerned. He spent the next hour at the airport making phone calls, first to his assistant, instructing her to reschedule his conference presentation, then to a colleague who specialized in civil rights law, then to the media relations office for the federal judiciary. By the time he boarded a later flight that afternoon, the wheels were already in motion. On his phone, he had a 20-minute video documenting every detail of his harassment. In his briefcase, he had the business cards of 3 passengers who had witnessed the entire event and offered to serve as witnesses. In his notebook, he had detailed, written observations of the officers' conduct, their statements, and the ways in which they had violated established security protocols. But Judge Williams was just getting started. During the flight, he used the plane's Wi-Fi to research Officer Rodriguez and Supervisor Pierce. What he found made him clench his jaw with a cold fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. Pierce had 4 prior complaints filed against her for discriminatory screening practices. All 4 had been filed by Black or Hispanic travelers. All 4 had been dismissed by the airport's internal review process for insufficient evidence. The pattern was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Rodriguez had been involved in 3 similar incidents over the past 2 years. In each case, he had subjected a minority traveler to an unusually aggressive screening process that turned up no security concerns. In each case, the traveler had filed a complaint. And in each case, their complaint had been buried by a bureaucratic process designed to protect the officers, not to address misconduct. By the time Judge Williams's plane landed at his destination, he had a comprehensive strategy in place. This would not be a simple complaint filed through normal channels and then forgotten. This was going to be a systemic dismantling of the culture that allowed officers like Rodriguez and Pierce to operate with impunity for years. He called his wife from the airport and explained what had happened. She wasn't surprised. As a successful Black woman and an attorney herself, she had experienced similar treatment while traveling. But she was surprised by the steel in her husband's voice. She recognized the tone. It was the same tone he used right before he was about to pronounce a sentence that would change someone's life forever. After checking into his hotel, Judge Williams spent the evening preparing, not for the conference presentation he had given dozens of times, but for the war he was about to declare on institutional racism within the airport security system. He drafted a detailed timeline of the incident, cross-referencing it with the timestamps on his video recording. He researched the federal regulations governing airport security procedures and the constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure. He identified the specific policies that Rodriguez and Pierce had violated and the remedies available under federal law. Most importantly, he began reaching out to his network of contacts throughout the federal justice system. Judge Williams had spent 15 years building relationships with colleagues, law enforcement officials, civil rights attorneys, and media professionals. Now, he was going to leverage every single one of them to ensure that what happened to him would never happen to another innocent traveler again. The next morning, he made the call that set everything in motion. He contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office in the district where the airport was located. The prosecutor who took his call seemed skeptical at first. After all, airport security incidents were usually handled as administrative matters, not federal criminal cases. But as Judge Williams detailed everything that had happened, including the officer's access to protected legal documents and the pattern of systematically targeting minority travelers, the prosecutor's tone changed completely. This wasn't just a complaint about rude treatment. This was potential evidence of a conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. Within hours, FBI agents were reviewing the surveillance footage from the security checkpoint. Federal prosecutors were reviewing the employment records of Pierce and Rodriguez, and civil rights lawyers were preparing what would become one of the most significant discrimination lawsuits in the history of airport security. Pierce and Rodriguez had no idea what was coming. They went back to work the next day, assuming their encounter with the well-dressed black man was just another routine incident that would be forgotten within a week. They had no way of knowing that they had just handed a federal judge everything he needed to expose years of systemic discrimination and abuse of power. Judge Williams spent the rest of the week systematically building his case. Every phone call was strategic, every document was carefully reviewed, and every piece of evidence was cataloged with the precision of a man who had spent decades in a courtroom. But what Rodriguez and Pierce still didn't understand was that their problems were about to get exponentially worse. The FBI's investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Agent Sarah Chun, assigned to the case, brought 15 years of experience in civil rights investigations. What she found in the first 48 hours of reviewing the airport surveillance footage sickened her. The cameras had captured everything, not just the harassment of Judge Williams, but dozens of similar incidents involving other travelers over the past several months. Pierce and Rodriguez had been systematically targeting well-dressed Black and Hispanic passengers, subjecting them to invasive searches that white travelers never experienced. The pattern was so blatant that Agent Chen wondered how it had gone undetected for so long. The answer emerged when she started digging into the airport's complaint process. Every complaint filed against Pierce and Rodriguez for the past 3 years had been handled by the same administrator, a man named Tom Bradley, who had apparently made it his personal mission to protect the officers from any consequences for their actions. Bradley had been dismissing complaints without proper investigation. He had been filing incident reports that downplayed the officers' misconduct. He had been coaching Pierce and Rodriguez on how to write their statements to avoid any admission of wrongdoing. What Agent Chun was uncovering wasn't just individual racism. It was institutional corruption designed to enable and protect it. Meanwhile, Judge Williams was making his own strategic moves. He contacted colleagues who had experienced similar treatment while traveling. The stories he received were equally infuriating and heartbreaking. Judge Patricia Washington from Chicago described being pulled aside for extra screening every single time she flew, despite having TSA pre-check. Judge Robert Martinez from Texas told him about an officer who had insisted on searching his confidential court documents, claiming they looked suspicious. Judge Angela Brooks from Florida had been subjected to so many invasive pat-downs that she had started driving to conferences instead of flying. It became clear that successful Black and Hispanic judges were not isolated targets. They were part of a broader pattern of harassment that extended to doctors, lawyers, business executives, and anyone whose appearance challenged the stereotypes held in the minds of officers like Rodriguez and Pierce. Judge Williams compiled these accounts into a comprehensive report and shared it with the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Aviation Administration. He also leaked parts of it to an investigative journalist who had been covering discrimination in airport security for years. The media response was swift and furious. National news outlets picked up the story. Within days, the video that Judge Williams had recorded became Exhibit A in a national conversation about racial profiling in airport security. Cable news programs played the footage on a loop, showing Rodriguez and Pierce treating a federal judge like a common criminal. The optics were devastating for the airport authority. Here was a distinguished jurist, a man who had dedicated his career to upholding the law, being humiliated by officers who couldn't articulate a single legitimate reason for their actions. The contrast between Williams's calm professionalism and the officer's transparent bias was impossible to ignore. Pierce and Rodriguez found themselves at the center of a media firestorm they were completely unprepared to handle. Their names and faces were plastered across national newspapers and television screens. Their employment records were dissected by reporters who had obtained them through Freedom of Information Act requests. Their private lives were scrutinized by journalists who wanted to understand how people with such obvious biases had been allowed to remain in positions of authority. The airport authorities' initial response was predictably defensive. They issued a statement claiming their officers had followed proper procedure and that any allegations of discrimination were unfounded. That response lasted for exactly 48 hours, the amount of time it took for Agent Chen to give them a preview of the FBI's findings. Suddenly, the airport authorities' tune changed completely. They announced that Pierce and Rodriguez had been suspended pending a full investigation. They pledged to review all security procedures and implement additional anti-bias training. They hired an outside consulting firm to conduct a full audit of their screening practices. But Judge Williams wasn't interested in their damage control. He had seen too many institutions promise reform, only to revert to their old ways once the media attention faded. He wanted accountability, not just apologies. Working with civil rights attorney Michelle Roberts, Judge Williams filed a federal lawsuit seeking both monetary damages and systemic reforms. The lawsuit named Pierce and Rodriguez as individual defendants, along with their supervisor, Tom Bradley, and the airport authority itself. It alleged violations of the Fourth Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and multiple federal civil rights statutes. The lawsuit detailed not only Judge Williams's experience, but the experiences of dozens of other travelers who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment by the same officers. It included statistical analysis showing that Pierce and Rodriguez searched black passengers at a rate that far exceeded any reasonable security justification. It documented the airport authorities' deliberate indifference to complaints of discriminatory conduct. Most damningly, the lawsuit included excerpts from internal emails and text messages that Agent Chun had uncovered during her investigation. Messages in which Pierce and Rodriguez made explicitly racist comments about the passengers they were targeting. Messages in which they joked about making certain travelers miss their flights. Messages that revealed the harassment was not just biased, but intentional and malicious. Rodriguez had written to a colleague that he enjoyed putting entitled travelers in their place. Pierce had texted a complaint about fancy-dress thugs who thought they were better than the TSA. The communications provided direct evidence of discriminatory intent, the very thing that is often so difficult to prove in civil rights cases. The discovery process in the lawsuit revealed even more disturbing information. Pierce and Rodriguez had received performance reviews that actually praised them for their thoroughness in conducting screenings. Their supervisors had been aware of the pattern of complaints, but had interpreted it as evidence that the officers were doing their jobs effectively. Tom Bradley, the administrator who had been dismissing the complaints, received a bonus that was based in part on keeping the number of resolved complaints low. The system was designed to reward the very behavior that violated travelers' constitutional rights. When Judge Williams sat for his own deposition, he testified with the same calm authority he commanded on the bench. He walked the defense attorneys through every detail of his experience, providing timestamps, identifying witnesses, and explaining with precision how each of Pierce's and Rodriguez's actions had violated established security protocols. When Rodriguez's lawyer tried to argue that the search had been conducted according to standard procedure, Judge Williams flashed the same predatory smile Pierce had seen at the airport. He produced a thick binder containing the TSA's actual guidelines and began reading aloud the specific sections Rodriguez had violated. He had done his homework, and it showed. Pierce's deposition was a disaster for the defense. Under questioning from Michelle Roberts, Pierce admitted that she had never received training on how to conduct unbiased screenings. She admitted that the vast majority of her aggressive searches had involved minority passengers. When asked to explain the statistical discrepancy, she claimed it was just a coincidence. Roberts then presented Pierce with printouts of her own text messages, including the ones in which she had used racial slurs to describe passengers. Pierce's lawyer objected repeatedly, but the evidence was overwhelming. These were not officers making good-faith security decisions. These were individuals using their authority to act on personal prejudice. The case never went to trial. Faced with a mountain of evidence that all but guaranteed a massive jury verdict, the airport authority agreed to a settlement of $8.5 million. But more importantly, from Judge Williams's perspective, they agreed to comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future discrimination. The settlement required the immediate termination of Pierce, Rodriguez, and Tom Bradley. It mandated anti-bias training for all security personnel. It established an independent oversight board to investigate complaints of discrimination. And it required statistical monitoring of search patterns to identify potential bias before it became systemic. Judge Williams donated a share of the settlement to a civil rights organization dedicated to airport security reform. The money, he said, was never his motivation. His motivation was ensuring that no other traveler would have to endure what he had. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond a single airport. The Department of Transportation used the settlement as a model for reforms at airports across the country. Other travelers who had been subjected to discriminatory treatment found attorneys willing to take their cases, knowing that Judge Williams had established a powerful legal precedent. Pierce and Rodriguez found themselves unemployable in law enforcement or security. Their names were so closely associated with racial profiling that no agency would risk hiring them. Rodriguez eventually found work as a security guard at a warehouse for a fraction of his former salary. Pierce left the security field entirely and took a job in retail management. Tom Bradley faced federal criminal charges for his role in covering up the discrimination. He pleaded guilty to violating civil rights under color of law and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. His conviction sent a clear message to other administrators. Protecting discriminatory officers could lead to personal criminal liability. But perhaps the most important outcome was the cultural shift that Judge Williams's case helped to accelerate. His willingness to fight back, combined with the undeniable evidence he had gathered, made it impossible for institutions to dismiss complaints of discrimination as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Other judges began speaking out about their own experiences with biased treatment while traveling. Professional organizations began tracking complaints of discrimination and pushing for systemic reforms. The legal community recognized that even its most distinguished members were not immune from the kind of harassment that ordinary citizens had been enduring for years. Agent Chun went on to investigate similar cases at airports across the country. The techniques she had developed while investigating Pierce and Rodriguez became standard procedure for civil rights investigations. She testified before Congress about the need for greater oversight of airport security practices and helped draft legislation that strengthened protections against discriminatory treatment. Judge Williams returned to his courtroom with a renewed understanding of how institutional bias operates and how difficult it is for ordinary citizens to challenge it. He began to incorporate that perspective into his judicial rulings, particularly in cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. Judge Williams had proven that sometimes justice requires more than a robe. It requires the courage to stand up when an institution fails and the determination to make sure that your experience is the last of its kind. Rodriguez and Pierce thought they could intimidate a successful black man with impunity. Instead, they handed him the very evidence he needed to dismantle their entire discriminatory system and send a message that would echo in airports across the nation.